Today on your Finance and Economy Today, where we review facts, data, insights, and how it affects you. Jared Kushner's private equity firm has raised nearly $5 billion from Middle Eastern governments, including $2 billion from Saudi Arabia alone, arriving 6 months after he left the White House. We're breaking down the money, the timeline, and the conflict of interest questions two congressional committees are now investigating. Jared Kushner left the White House on January 20, 2021. The very next day, he incorporated a private investment firm called Affinity Partners. About 6 months later, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund invested $2 billion into that firm. Over the next 12 minutes, we'll cover three things: the $2 billion Saudi deal, the conflict of interest question it raises, and what congressional investigators are doing about it right now. This is not a story about a proven crime, it's a story about money, timing, and access, and the questions they raise. Let's start with the numbers. Let's start with the timeline. Jared Kushner served for 4 years as one of the Trump administration's key Middle East negotiators, building a close personal relationship with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. On January 20, 2021, the first Trump administration ended, and Kushner became a private citizen. The very next day, January 21st, he incorporated a new investment firm in Delaware, Affinity Partners. About 6 months later, Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, the kingdom's sovereign wealth fund, invested $2 billion into Affinity. That single check made Saudi Arabia one of Affinity's largest backers, right out of the gate. By 2026, Affinity had raised roughly $4.8 billion total, most of it from sovereign wealth funds across the Middle East. And according to SEC filings cited by the Senate Finance Committee, Affinity has collected about $157 million in fees since it launched, including roughly $87 million specifically from Saudi Arabia. So to recap, a firm founded one day after Kushner left government, funded within 6 months by the same government whose crown prince he had spent years building ties with, has now pocketed tens of millions of dollars a year in fees. Those are the numbers. What they mean is where this gets complicated. But to understand why this raised alarms, we need to see who Jared Kushner was. To understand why this raised eyebrows in Washington, you have to understand who Jared Kushner was inside the West Wing. For 4 years, he served as a senior White House advisor and one of the administration's lead negotiators in the Middle East. He helped broker the Abraham Accords, and along the way, he built an unusually close personal relationship with Saudi Arabia's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. That relationship was well known in Washington, reported on repeatedly by outlets including NBC News, Axios, and The Hill. There's a long-standing norm in American government, though not always a hard legal requirement, that officials take some kind of cooling-off period before cashing in on the relationships they built in office. The idea is simple. The public shouldn't have to wonder whether a policy decision was made to help the country or to set up a future payday. Kushner's timeline compressed that norm to almost nothing. He left government on a Wednesday and incorporated Affinity Partners the next day. 6 months after that, the same government whose leader he had spent 4 years courting wired $2 billion into his new firm. That sequence is exactly what caught the attention of House Oversight Committee Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney. In a formal letter dated June 2, 2022, Maloney opened a congressional investigation into the deal. Her letter stated that Kushner's close relationship with the Saudi Crown Prince, his history of pro-Saudi positions while in government, and the kingdom's decision to fund his firm, quote, create the appearance of a conflict of interest. It's important to be precise about what that means. A congressional letter raising the appearance of a conflict is not a legal finding. Nobody has been charged. No court or agency has ruled that any law was broken. But the appearance itself, a policymaker's family firm getting billions from the same governments he negotiated with, is exactly what watchdogs say the rules around public service exist to prevent. So how exactly does the money work? So how does a brand new private equity firm, with no track record, land $2 billion from a foreign government in its first year? To answer that, you need to understand how firms like Affinity Partners actually make money. Private equity funds typically charge 2 layers of fees: a management fee, usually around 2% of assets under management every year, just for running the fund, and a performance fee, sometimes called carried interest, that pays out a cut of any profits. Reporting citing SEC filings, and cited by the Senate Finance Committee, put Affinity's total fee collection at roughly $157 million since launch. Of that, about $87 million came specifically from Saudi Arabia's investment. That means Kushner and his firm get paid whether or not the fund's investments perform well over the long run. The fees flow simply because the Saudi money is sitting inside Affinity's accounts. And the Saudi PIF wasn't Affinity's only Middle Eastern backer. By 2026, sovereign wealth funds from across the region had put in roughly $4.8 billion combined. What makes this different from an ordinary private equity story is the overlap in timing. While Affinity was raising and managing this money, Kushner remained a visible, trusted voice on Middle East policy connected to the Trump political orbit, the same region, often the same governments, whose money was now funding his firm. Watchdogs and members of Congress say that overlap is the entire issue, not that foreign governments invest in American private equity, which happens all the time, but that this particular government was investing in this particular person, whose family influence over policy toward that government was well established. Kushner and Affinity have not been shown to have broken any specific rule governing the fees themselves. The concern investigators are raising is about the relationship between the money and the policy influence, not the mechanics of the fund. Here's the legal question Washington is now asking. So is any of this illegal? That's the exact question two congressional committees are trying to answer right now. And it's worth being precise about the law, because this is not a simple yes or no. Kushner was a private citizen when Affinity Partners was formed, so the emoluments clauses of the Constitution, which restrict what a sitting president can accept from foreign governments, don't directly apply to him. Instead, the legal question centers on a different statute, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, known as FARA. FARA requires anyone acting as an agent of a foreign government or a foreign political interest in a political or quasi-political capacity to register that relationship with the Justice Department. Critics say Kushner's pattern looks like exactly what FARA was designed to catch: a person with deep ties to a foreign government's leadership receiving large sums of money tied to that relationship without the transparency FARA requires. Nobody has determined that Kushner was legally required to register, or that he violated the statute. That's an open question, not a settled one. In late 2024, Senator Ron Wyden and Representative Jamie Raskin sent a letter asking the Attorney General to appoint a special counsel to investigate potential FARA violations, a request, not a formal charge. Then, in March of 2026, Wyden and Representative Robert Garcia opened a fresh, joint investigation through the House Oversight Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. Garcia put it directly on the record. Quote, Jared Kushner raising billions from Middle Eastern governments for his private equity firm, pocketing tens of millions in fees each year while serving as Donald Trump's Middle East envoy, raises serious concerns about his potential violations of conflict of interest laws. End quote. That is a member of Congress stating a concern and opening an inquiry. It is not a court ruling, and no finding of wrongdoing has been made against Kushner in this matter. Now, what does all this actually mean for you? This isn't the kind of story where you can point to a single price at the grocery store and say, that's the Kushner effect. There's no line item on your receipt for this, but that doesn't mean it doesn't cost you anything. The cost here is slower, and it's about trust. When a government official spends years shaping foreign policy toward a specific country, and then that same country's sovereign wealth fund becomes one of his biggest financial backers within months of him leaving office, it changes the incentives for everyone watching. Future officials learn a lesson, whether or not any law was ever broken here. The relationships you build while serving the public can become the foundation of a personal fortune, on a timeline measured in months, not years. That is the precedent watchdogs are worried about. Not just this one deal, but what it teaches the next official weighing a decision that touches a foreign government's interests. There's also a foreign policy cost. American Middle East policy is supposed to reflect what's good for the United States. When the family of the person shaping that policy is simultaneously collecting fees from the same governments, it becomes harder for anyone, allies, adversaries, or the American public, to fully trust that the policy wasn't shaped even in part by what came after. None of this shows up in a stock ticker or a jobs report. It shows up in something harder to measure: whether Americans believe their government serves them first, and whether foreign governments believe access to Washington can be bought, just on a longer clock. Here's the bottom line. Jared Kushner founded Affinity Partners one day after leaving government. 6 months later, Saudi Arabia gave the firm $2 billion. 2 congressional committees are now investigating whether that overlap crossed a legal line. Nobody has found that it did. This is reported fact and open inquiry, not a verdict. If this investigation matters to you, follow along. We'll update you the moment Congress or the Justice Department reaches a conclusion. Like and subscribe to stay informed.